as we get ready to get started, there's just going to be some handouts that are going to be coming around your way. So this afternoon's session is using Fidelity assessments to improve the outcomes of Housing First programs, and it's a mini workshop. My name is Kelly Gauze. I'm going to be moderating your session today, and just a little bit about me. I'm the manager of Housing Special Projects for the City of Windsor, and I live, work, and play on the Three Fires Confederacy, home of the Anishinaabe, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa people. And with us today is Catherine Gibb. Catherine has worked in the field of housing and homelessness for over 20 years within shelter, outreach, and supportive housing settings. As the program manager for the supportive housing at SHIP, she leads a multidisciplinary team within the Mississauga, Ontario area. Catherine embeds Housing First principles in her work and has been a member of the Ontario and Canada Housing First Network Community of Interest Steering Committee since 2019. Wally Check is the Director of Training and Technical Assistance for the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness program and has been with them since its inception in 2015. Wally is considered to be a national expert in a variety of areas associated with ending homelessness. Wally has provided communities across Canada and internationally through himself or his staff expert consultation and or training to assist them in implementing best practices for reducing and ending homelessness. Wally also has a background in clinical psychology, which has aided him in building and delivering effective support to TTA consumers. Wally also maintains a small private counseling practice in Lethbridge, Alberta, where he resides with his family. And Tim Aubrey is a professor with the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa. So welcome to our presenters today, and welcome. We are on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq peoples, and we will get started.
Good. All right. Welcome. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. For this session on Fidelity of Housing First. Nice to see such a mix of locations you're coming from. And this, now is it just, yeah, just here. Oh, it's not going good. That, oh, down here. Sorry. No, it's not going.
Isn't this lovely? You just do it this way.
Okay.
Now it should. Now it'll go.
Okay. Okay, so this is a session we've had. When was the first one, Wally? Do you remember? I know we had one in Hamilton. Well, that's a few years ago. On Fidelity, and you may think, well, if you've had one, why would you do more? Well, certainly the participants change at this conference. I can't believe the size of it, but also there's new programs, new Housing First programs, and I also think refreshers on what is Housing First are important, because the words get thrown around a fair bit, those two words, and it starts to mean all sorts of things. So this idea of Housing First, it's evidence-based. It's got a research base behind it, very, very good research in Canada, but also in the United States, and now in various countries in Europe. But what it means is where it's effective, there's an application of a particular model. And that's the model we're going to talk about here today. It's called the Pathways Model of Housing First, okay? Now, this will be, let me ask first of all, who's coming from Housing First programs? Ooh, almost everybody, eh? And whose program has had their fidelity assessed? Okay, that's good. And whose programs have had their fidelity assessed more than once? Okay. All right, so let me start with what is Fidelity, okay? Essentially, what we're gonna present is the recipe for Housing First. And Fidelity are the ingredients that go into the recipe, okay? We also call them standards sometimes. That's certainly used as well, okay? And so Fidelity is the extent that you're following this model of Housing First that has evidence behind it, okay? Now, when we talk about standards, when we talk about ingredients to a particular cake that we want to talk about the different aspects about it. And often we talk about structure, and we also talk about process. Okay, so in this slide there's program design, but there's also operation, how it gets delivered. And that gives you the results, okay? Now, in this framework, there's a group of domains. There's 5 domains, okay? Now, most of you are from Housing First program, so this is going to be a review, and I'll go over it quite quickly. But this is how the principles of Housing First get translated into a living program, okay? So how we operationalize it in Fidelity terms is we talk about the housing. What kind of housing is being delivered, okay? Is there choice in terms of the housing? Is it permanent, okay? So there are standards that relate to the housing in the program. Of course, we know Housing First is housing and support, or housing and services, okay? And I was pleased to hear Jeff Olivet in his keynote say, housing is not Housing First without the support, okay? And that's something that has worn away in the Housing First world. So a domain is the services that are being delivered, okay? And we talk about different services. We try to make them as comprehensive as possible, as intensive as possible. Sometimes it's a form of case management, and we rely on community partners to help out. And sometimes it's wraparound, okay? So the 2 models are intensive case management or assertive community treatment, okay? And there is this idea in the Housing First world, it's not necessarily actualized this way, that people with the most complex needs should get the assertive community treatment, and more moderate needs should be intensive case management, okay? So there is that distinction between types of services. Now, you see the domains, you know, Housing First programs, psychiatric services are important, access to addictions treatment are important, but also integration kind of services, vocational employment, educational, okay? So that's a domain. Then there's separating the housing and services. And here we talk about there's no housing readiness required for people to move in, okay? People have a lease. They have a lease like everyone else. That's a standard, okay? And then it's recovery oriented out of the mental health field, eh? Recovery. And in the mental health world, that's a very, very important idea now, okay? And it's not so much recovering from an illness, but it's living sometimes with an illness or disability, but still being future-oriented and functioning and putting together a life in the community that's meaningful and satisfying. So In the recovery-oriented domain, you can see self-determination is important, harm reduction is important, and again, this idea of autonomy or choice. And then finally, we get to the way the program is actually delivered, the program operations, okay? So there's, team structure, there's the staff-client ratio. Intensive case management tends to be 12 to 15 to 1. Assertive community treatment tends to be 8 to 10 to 1. That determines the intensity of the services, okay? Are there meetings, regular meetings to review how people are doing in the program? That's also a standard within this program operations. So you can see that there's 5 domains. Now, we've handed out the current Fidelity measure. Okay, encore, est-ce que quelqu'un d'autre francophone qui est venu après qu'on a circulé? Non? Ça va? On a une copie, on a des copies en français. Okay, we're good? Okay. So, why is it important, this Fidelity? Well, getting back to what I was saying earlier, we know it works. We know it ends homelessness for people. We know it transforms lives, Housing First. That it makes a huge difference helping people get into safe, adequate housing. And their quality of life goes up. And they start thinking about the future and so on. Well, here's the thing. From the research that we have that has looked at Fidelity using a measure like the one you've got in front of you, the higher the score on that measure, the better your outcomes. The better the housing stability among the participants who are in the Housing First program, better the functioning. We have research that shows that. And the higher the level of quality of life, okay? So that's why we want to target delivering programs with high fidelity. And we'll talk about, it's not nobody gets perfect fidelity. Every program is an adaptation, and we'll talk about that. Even the best programs. And the best programs have adaptations that are innovative and that make programs even better, okay? And the other thing I'm going to say about Fidelity is it's not set in stone, okay? Wally has has revised this measure with Samson Barris, I guess 2 years ago, eh, Wally? Because Housing First is evolving. It's changing, and it'll continue to change. So probably there'll be another revision in a few years. So if you look at the measure in front of you, okay, it has a continuum or a scale, 1 to 4. Essentially, it's trying to capture the gradation of fidelity on each of the standards. There's about 40 standards in the measure, if you go through it. And again, you see the 5 domains, okay? A 4 is high fidelity on a standard. A 1 is low fidelity. So it goes from low to high. I mean, it's very intuitive that way.
Just make a quick comment.
Yeah.
So 2 reasons I came up here. 1 was because I wanted to make a comment, but 2 is because I have to plug in my laptop or it's going to shut off. But the comment I wanted to make was, when we talk about standards, I think it's important to remember that we're not talking about like accreditation level standards. And when Tim talked about, that the higher the score, the higher the outcomes. And that's an important distinction because it's not a pass or fail. It's a continuum that lets you know that if I can make our program higher on this scale in these areas, that we are going to have, and research has proven, that we are going to have better outcomes. The individuals that we're supporting are going to stay housed longer. They're going to have greater productivity in their lives according to what they want, and those kinds of things, right? So just wanted to make that distinction, and then I'm going to plug this in really quick so Tim doesn't freak out here in a second. So.
Okay. Let's go. As you can tell, we spent hours choreographing this mini workshop. Okay. Thanks, Wally. You think we're good? Oh, you're looking for a plug?
I'm looking for the outlet. I think it's way over there.
Yeah. Is there one there? There might be one at Catherine's feet here. Is that a?
No. Just go. We'll
Okay.
pray for us.
Exactly, yes. Okay, so then, so you've got the measure in front of you. We're going to work with that
The
measure.
other thing is that we're going to be doing an interactive activity with that measure in a bit. So, have a look and get some sense of some areas of that are of interest to you.
And we're going to pull, based on your choice, specific, I guess maybe the term, what do you call them? Items, I guess, is better than standards. You think standards a bit too loaded?
I don't know. You can call them standards. I just wanted to make
Yeah.
sure that they understood that it wasn't like a...
No, exactly. So why should programs assess fidelity? Well, we talked about, you want to find out, do you have decent fidelity? But it also can guide you in terms of program development. You have a new program. You're learning. Maybe it's the first Housing First program in your community, okay? So it's a program development tool, okay? But it's also a program improvement tool. So you've been doing Housing First for 10 years, and it's gone well, but you're thinking, maybe there's some areas we could improve on. We have limited resources. We know how that works. So we can't, we can't necessarily address all the issues in front of us. But what if we wanted to take a look at ones that might be particularly important? Well, this measure can help you with that. It can guide you around planning technical assistance, okay? And there is a research function to it. In terms of, but our interest and the reason we do this session each year at CAEH is really because of program development and program improvement. That's what we're hoping you'll get out of this session. Okay, so there are different ways to assess, and those are also evolving in terms of assessing fidelity. So we're going to talk about these different ways, and we're going to talk about the positives or the strengths as well as the limitations, okay? And that we'll do that first before we get to the interactive exercise. So the first one is the external review, okay? So a team outside of your program, could be some local people, who do this work, but Wally's training unit at CAEH does this work and has done, how many external reviews would you have done, Wally, since 2015?
11. I don't know.
A lot. Is that not on your CV? But it has certainly been the most common way of assessing fidelity. You get an external team who visit, and over 1 or 2 days assess fidelity, and I'll show you the methods that are used. There is some pre-visit information that's gathered. Program documents are important, okay? to really get a sense that before you show up in person, you've got some idea of the program. If the fidelity's been assessed previously, you want to see the report, if it's been evaluated, and so on and so forth. But then during the visit, you can see here the external team will sit in on your meeting, case review meeting, okay? There'll be some interviews. You're going to hear from the staff. And the interviews are targeted at the fidelity items. You're doing a scan on the program. Often there's a lunch with participants, like a focus group. It's usually about 90 minutes, an hour, 90 minutes. Yeah. Key partner interviews, so people who maybe they refer people to the program, or they provide services. Intensive case management, there's brokering of services, so you want to talk to the partners. There's a home visit. And is that usually, Wally, the home visit? I know when I've done the external review, there's been a home visit.
Yeah, we do,
So that's the on-site visit, okay? At the end of the day or the day and a half, the team gets together with the program staff and goes through the fidelity results and provides some recommendations, okay?
Can I just add
Yeah.
a few bits in there about that? So when we talk about the interviews and when we talk about the partner interviews, one of the items that's talked about in the fidelity is not just having access to services. So if you're like an intensive case management model and you're brokering things out, especially in the clinical services, like, services for mental health or whatever, maybe it's even connecting to employment. An item in the fidelity is about having formal linkages. And so there's a difference between whether you have a connection to the organization because you know somebody that works there, that kind of makes it easier for you to work with them, or sometimes you're just stuck with what the normal route is into that organization. So if you have a process that's established by your local addictions counseling organization to be able to refer somebody, well, then that's just the normal route. Whereas a formal linkage is that you have established with each other an agreement. Because many of you know that the individuals that you're supporting in Housing First programs are not often able to access those supports through the normal processes. And so we want you to be able to create new processes with these organizations that means you have to teach them about Housing First. They have to understand what it is. And so it's creating those linkages in that way and then establishing an MOU with them. So that if your friend who works at Acme Support Services happens to leave and go somewhere else, which interestingly enough people in this sector do, you don't lose that connection. It's on file. There's an MOU on file that keeps that connection alive. I also just wanted to quickly add that on-site as well is we will conduct chart or file reviews, which is not like an audit. It's not that at all, but it's looking for elements of these fidelity components within their documentation language and so forth, right? So being on site allows us to be able to see those files as well as to be able to then see them in operation and see if there's consistency in what they're reporting versus what's actually happening. And again, it's not a punitive process. It's just an observation process. And we try to really make it clear for organizations that we are not coming in to grade you. We are coming in to provide you true, honest, helpful, sometimes difficult information that is only going to help your organization improve its services and improve its outcomes. So just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, why don't we talk about together though yeah, so it's multiple sources of data using multiple methods, eh? Okay, so that's why. So it's rigorous because in terms of being able to get on that measure and to assess it on those items. So this first one, so we'll talk, when we go through each of them, you'll see there's actually 4 different ways of doing a fidelity assessment. So do you want to talk about the strengths and limitations?
Sure, sure. The other thing I'll add before I do this quickly is one of the methods that we're going to talk about, and I'm not going to get into detail about it until we get to it here, is a self-assessment. But part of what we do when we do the external reviews is we also have the organization do a self-assessment before we come. So that's part of the pre-visit process, is that they will do a self-assessment, and then they send the results of that to us ahead of time, and then we are able to also have that to help sort of gauge our visit and what we do when we come. And then we can compare that, and in our report, we provide a comparison for them between what the results of their self-assessment were and the results of our external assessment. But so what happens is that in terms of strengths, the external assessment is a great way to give people an opportunity to discuss and talk with you about how, what are the operations of their program and how can things maybe be adjusted and what types of shifts in the design of their program could be made to help them either score better on those fidelity items or just have better outcomes in general. It gives us the opportunity to have that direct communication, right? One thing that I do notice that will get talked about, I think, a little bit when we discuss some of the limitations of a virtual type review is, and I just mentioned it briefly a minute ago, is the idea that, and again, not because we're trying to catch people in anything, but you do get a chance to see what's being talked about, as opposed to just hearing what people are telling you about their program. And many programs will tell you, this is what we're doing, and it's not because they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes. They really honestly feel like they're doing what they need to be doing. And like I said, our job, I feel like, is to come in and be able to help you understand, yes, you are, or here's maybe how it could be tweaked. And so being there in person allows, I think, a lot more of that ability to actually see and to interact with what's happening at the program level and see what's going on from day to day. So it's also a great way to provide to your funders or to anybody that you might be accountable to the results that you can say, this came from people who actually came to our organization, came to our community, and they've offered this input and this feedback to us. And so it can be very helpful in validating your organization. I remember one year, several years ago, and we have Susan here who can attest to this, but we were in Brandon, Manitoba, and we did a fidelity review there. And the report from that review, because, and this is probably going to resonate with a lot of you, but it talked about the lack of rent subsidies available to those individuals. But that report, because it came from someone external, actually provided a lot of evidence and ammunition for that organization to make a plea into the community, and they had actually private individuals come forward and offer dollars towards rent subsidies, right? So, but it was being an external report that made that possible. And then, of course, it gives the opportunity. It's almost like a mini workshop or a mini training as well when we're there in person. Like when we do the debriefing at the end of the 2 days, then it gives us a chance to be able to help educate and to teach and to work with and mentor that organization. And so sometimes being there, that's a little bit easier because they can interact a little bit more fulsomely. some of the challenges, and there are some challenges with it, and the biggest one, the most important one, is that it's not free, right? It's not, unless you've got a funder that's willing to take care of that or whatever, there's a cost associated with it, because it means we come in usually with a team of 3 people to come in and do that work.
Give a range of costs just for people.
Yeah, well, so, and we for us, we generally do things a little differently when it comes to that, because we know it's such a costly thing. But, we're probably looking at about, for our team to come to do a Fidelity review, just for the team fees for that day, it's probably about somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000. And then you have the travel expenses on top of that. However, most organizations who have done that, and some of them have done it multiple times, which is why Tim asked the question, have you had a second review or a follow-up review? Most organizations that we do that with have had us come back, because there's value in seeing where the progress is, value in seeing what's been adjusted, and if it actually makes sense to us as well as it does to them. And so they have always said that the cost associated the value of it far outweighs the cost. So anyway, one of the challenges that can come with it, though, is that you can have, sometimes people are on their best behavior and they're not necessarily being 100% natural, right? But again, it's beneficial for us to be there, because we try to set them at ease, and we try to help them realize that this is not, you're not being accredited. This is not a score thing for you to be worried about. And hopefully they can return back to sort of that normal thinking or way of being.
And I know, just related to that, JP is here for Moncton and has been involved in Fidelity assessments. But when we were doing it at home, you might remember this, JP, when we did the first Fidelity assessment, the staff talked about not being able to sleep for several days before this external team showed up.
We were the worst. We'd never done an act. Moncton had never gone into those services before. So when the Fidelity came in, we really didn't know what we were doing.
Oh, it was better than that.
Well, but by the end.
By the end.
So can I ask you, who was on the external team that came to see you?
Sam, Tim.
No, I was helping them, but Paula Goring was the lead.
Okay, and I can kind of see maybe if it was Sam, but see, we don't have that problem. People aren't afraid of us. So.
Sam did come.
Yeah.
I think once.
That's right.
Yeah. One of the challenges can be, depending upon who's doing the external review, is potentially the inability to see the charts. But what we find is that being able to go and be there in person, that it actually, makes it much easier for us, and we make sure that we get to look at files. And again, it's not a file audit, but we're looking at things like their case notes. We're looking at things like service or treatment plans, and we're looking for evidence of like person-centered practice, for evidence of use of important practices like motivational interviewing and those kinds of things. That's what we're hoping to find. We're looking for evidence of interaction with their participants, how often they're actually seeing them, and if the visits are purposeful or if they're just check-ins and those kinds of things. Did you have a question?
Yes, are you looking into HF5 files?
We're just looking into the files associated with their contacts, so contact notes and the things that they've established in terms of how they're going to work with that individual. So if all of that is being kept in HIFIS, and that's the only place, because I know a lot of people have gone to fully electronic through HIFIS, then sometimes we have some things that we work out ahead of time in terms of confidentiality or whatever, and we make arrangements to be able to sometimes just, they log us in to HIFIS and show us, or sometimes they'll print out the specific things that we need to see. Yeah. Okay. And then again, it depends on who's doing it. But 2 days may sometimes feel like that's not a lot to do a fidelity review. However, when you combine the pre-visit work that we do, as well as then after the visit, and Tim mentioned again the interviews with key partners, sometimes those are things that we'll conduct after because things in the schedule didn't work out or whatever. Oftentimes we are reconnecting with that organization to follow up, to get clarity on things and so forth. And so we incorporate a lot of elements that would be both pre and post kind of work into it as well. So it's not just what's happening that day or those 2 days. So yeah.
All right, so before we move on to self-assessment, I just want to speak about the external review, because my first experience with Fidelity assessment was part of our Housing First collaborative that we have in Peel Region. And when we started that in 2018, it was coming on the heels of Wally and his team coming and doing one of the external Fidelity assessments with one of those partners. And so we were able to utilize the learnings from that as we were developing the approach from a collaborative perspective on our Housing First program. And it was not intimidating. I can endorse the feedback from the team from that experience. So to look at self-assessment, again, different component, as Wally mentioned, of the external Fidelity assessment, but something that's really simple, accessible for you to utilize as an operational manager within Housing First. I can understand and relate to sort of the simplicity of utilizing the measure and the tool in order to do a bit of a self-assessment with your program. So you could take it and distribute it to your members of your team. I know that I've utilized it where we've gone through it in team meetings with the clinical team. In advance of our recent Fidelity assessment, we had collected the scoring done individually by other members, stakeholders within our organization, our housing department, some of our leadership, and looking at the results. And it really leads to some really interesting discussions. So again, it's a very simple approach. It's accessible. It's there in order for you to utilize. It's a bit of a roadmap on what high fidelity Housing First looks like. You can do it multiple times. You can use it as you're developing your programs. If you're wanting to aim to be high fidelity, it really sort of maps out exactly what that looks like. Again, the members that are a part of a self-assessment would really know the program well, so it's great information to gather from them, as well as it's a good orientation, onboarding approach with new staff around Housing First as an evidence-based practice. It takes a minimal amount of time to utilize, and again, there's actually no cost to using the measure because it's available for your use. Of course, there are some limitations in that we're going to want to score ourselves well, so there might be a bit of bias there. It does require an understanding of how to interpret the Fidelity standards. So you need to sort of have the sort of background information and knowledge to know how to assess the scores. You do need to facilitate it. So again, we've done that through some deliberate team meetings, and it's because we have the familiarity with the tools that we were able to kind of really get maximum impact from that. And again, it wouldn't necessarily be something you can bring to, say, a funder and say, this is how we're scoring ourselves. So it might just be something that is of utility within the team itself in the program.
It's kind of interesting because I was involved in using self-assessment with a bunch of programs across 9 countries, and they were able to do it, and we were doing it actually from a distance. Unfortunately, we didn't travel to those countries, but one of the things people said about the value of doing it, it's nice to get areas to target for improvement, which is what you'll get through the self-assessment, but they also learned a lot where they had difference of opinions about the program. Because you have to conciliate the scores. And to hear from different, staff that the views are very different from, another subgroup, it made for some very rich discussions. And helped them, quite frankly, by doing it, get on the same page about, what they were trying to accomplish in the program.
So just imagine what that's like if your team comes together after all scoring that themselves about the program, and multiple people on your team are seeing a particular item completely differently. What does that tell you, right? It's great for discussion.
And it happens. It's definitely happened within my program. And it did really lead to some great discussion. So this is an image of the manual of the collaborative fidelity assessment that was developed by Tim and Dr. Jeff Nelson. So this came about in 2019 as part of the Ontario Housing First Community of Interest. I'm looking to you to validate.
Yeah, that's right.
And so this was a pilot that was developed at that time around a peer approach to fidelity assessment. And I was lucky enough to be a part of the network at that time and be a part of testing and piloting this with another local organization from within Toronto. So it really lays out the methodology of how to do a peer exchange approach to doing fidelity assessment. Including the measure itself and sort of the different steps to prepare for it.
And it's interesting, this is, at the beginning I said, we call this an evidence-based programs. Well, obviously in mental health there are other evidence-based programs. And first episode programs, you familiar with those? First episode of psychosis, it's kind of a prevention, secondary prevention program. In Ontario, they have used this methodology across a whole host of first episode programs. And it's also been used in strengths-based case management. We used it in a project. So it's a methodology that evidence-based programs are using, assessing each other. So you talk about your experience.
Yeah. So when we did the exchange with CMHA Toronto, we were able to, we met in advance, got some information about the program, went through the process with, Jeff was the lead with that particular exchange, and then we each spent a day with each other's program. There was a smaller team, so for example, myself and 4 other members of the Housing First Collaborative attended the CMHA site in Toronto. We went through we observed the initial, the team meeting in the morning, and then we split off and we met with a peer from their team. So I met, as a program manager, I met with the program manager of that Housing First team and went through and did a semi-structured sort of interview on looking at the measures and identifying some of the scoring. We had the opportunity to do a focus group with clients from the program at a lunchtime pizza session. Jeff was able to do the chart review while we were doing this. And then at the end of the day, we came together as a team, the evaluators and Jeff, and we went through and we consolidated the scoring. And then from there, it was taken back and a preliminary report was created by Jeff. And it was a really great, go to the next slide here. So from that experience, from doing an on-site fidelity exchange, we were able to observe another program, a local program. We were able to learn from peers that were doing similar work. It was a capacity building opportunity, so it really enhanced our learning about Housing First principles by seeing how another program enacted the Housing First model. It was a way for us to explore adaptations and innovations. So, for example, our collaborative had the use of a flex fund that we could tap into when we had issues like damages and repairs or needing to provide funding for clinical needs. And so that program didn't have that, and then that was something they were able to take back and discuss and see if they could adapt that. Another strength of it, again, is a low-cost implementation. So it was just, the time, the mileage, small amount for honorariums, pizza for lunch. So again, it was a minimal cost. So if you don't have the resources to bring in an external consultant, this is another way that you could have a Fidelity review by an external party. Some of the challenges or limitations to it, it might be hard if you are, say, in a rural setting. You might not have another program that's close to you. We're lucky we are Toronto's neighbor. We have a few other sort of opportunities that we can do an exchange locally. It is a bit of additional work because you're sort of tapping into those service providers to do the work. Again, not everybody sort of has the same level of familiarity with the measure and the tool in order to assess. It does not usually include client perspective. Well, it can, like through the focus groups, but we weren't able to do the home visit, for example. So there was some limitations there. And then it's recommended for mature programs that have been in operation for a while. So from that experience, and I think I don't know if we were the only programs to do that.
Yeah, because we moved to virtual.
Yeah, because COVID happened. Yeah, so I know there was plans to do an exchange in Ottawa and potentially try it with other locations, but things sort of changed. But we were able to pilot it in a different way this year. So again, through the Canadian Housing First Network and through the leadership of Tim, we were able to identify that we would be able to do an international virtual Fidelity assessment and exchange from a peer perspective. And I'm not sure how we landed on Ireland.
How did we, good question.
It's a bad place to land.
I mean, unfortunately, we didn't actually literally land in Ireland. It was virtual.
Yeah, I think it's because I'm the descendant of the first Irish in Canada. But you don't want to hear about that. No, I think it was, we wanted a program that language was an issue, English. And I think it was just opportunistic. I knew they were scaling up Housing First in Ireland. It's part of their national strategy. And I had also had a link to one of the researchers, Ronnie Greenwood, who helped with the assessment. So it was really just, yeah, it just kind of happened that way. But we thought we could do it with two programs in Canada in different geographical locations. But why not extend it and make it even richer by going with quite a different context, eh? Once you get into another country, because all the things are different. Even though they are doing Housing First, we certainly found that out.
Mm-hmm. So again, the objective for doing this was just assistance, again, for quality improvement. So as was mentioned, it's not to grade or, there is that a little bit, you're feeling a little vulnerable if another program's coming in and trying to sort of evaluate how well you're doing naturally. But it was really meant to be an opportunity to learn and also to assist with the sort of the next step of this pilot was to see how it went virtually to do this exchange process. And just for context, I'll sort of mention just a quick bit of information about what the programs are about. So my organization SHIP is a supportive housing service provider in sort of the west, just west of Toronto. We have over 20 different programs and take a Housing First philosophy. So it's, supported housing. We offer continuum of services. We serve over 100 clients in the Mississauga area, and I have a multidisciplinary team of 19. With the Galway program, it's a very clinical program. They have sort of shades of ACT resources. They work within a system where they broker in psychiatry, health services, primary care, and again, the European system, the Irish system, they have a sort of that definite separation of supports and housing because they have a really strong social housing network there or system. So,
And it was interesting that, just if I could make a note of the Irish program, it wasn't assertive community treatment, but it was kind of a hybrid.
Yeah.
Because it was intensive case management, or they didn't call them case managers, they called them key workers. But they had in-house like a psychiatrist, and they had in-house a hoarding expert. I was at a session talking about hoarding, a huge issue with some tenants or clients in Housing First program. And they also had an addiction specialists.
yeah.
But these were people that were available not only for the Housing First program, but more generally. So that was kind of interesting. You get
Yeah.
to see a different model,
Yeah.
even though it's Housing First, no question.
They had a great vocational program. Again, the psychologist was impressive,
That's right,
being a
yeah,
part of the team. Our program does have hoarding, trauma, addictions, peer, dual diagnosis justice, seniors, but some of those other components were missing, and so they were.
Yes.
But again, with themselves, they were building out on their peer approach, so that was something that they hadn't quite adapted yet. So it was very interesting to learn about the differences in the systems internationally. So in methodology, again, it was very similar to what we've spoken about already, the document review. So again, getting that information in advance of the exchange where you're looking at the org chart and like the structure of the teams. We were able to share previous evaluations. So from the Irish program, we received a preliminary report on their Housing First implementation that spoke to a higher level about their Housing First approach in the country. We were able to share a report from our Housing First program that was done by John Ecker a few years ago as one of our preliminary documents. And information about the community, and it definitely that is really important when you're doing something internationally, to just provide that context going into when you're asking the questions of your peer. Case conference meeting. There were some challenges there given the time difference. So ideally, you would be observing the case conference meeting if you can make it work and there's no time difference challenges. Client interviews. So again, that's typically, it might be a focus group, but we found it was easier logistically to do one-to-one interviews with an assortment of clients. Looking at the program manager interviews as well as case manager or your frontline clinical staff, and then having the chart review. So the chart review does take some work. I recommend if you're wanting to do this that you factor in the logistics of that. I did spend quite a bit of time redacting information from files and preparing them in advance. So what it looked like when we were doing the assessment for the Galway program in Ireland, reviewing the documents, we observed a case conference meeting. There were 2 client interviews that were conducted, individual, and 6 interviews with the team, the frontline staff team, and then 2 with program managers. And then the privacy is something that you need to factor in when you're doing this, consulting with your privacy officer, what it looks like. So what we came up with our exchange was that Ronnie Greenwood, who was the researcher in Ireland, managed the chart reviews for the Irish program, and then Tim was able to do the ones for our program. So we didn't have to get into the challenges of trying to figure out how to transmit some of this very highly sensitive information across international lines. So when our SHIP program was reviewed, again, it was that review of the documents. There were 4 client interviews. There were 5 clinician interviews, program manager interviews. It says here 3, but there were 5. Yeah, so that's a typo. And then there was 4 chart reviews. So reflections on this approach. Again, it was really a great learning experience for the teams to learn from this other, I was really impressed with the Irish program. And I got that feedback from my team as well. And it was a great opportunity to observe from a distance what it looks like in another country. Again, it was definitely a capacity building opportunity for some of the frontline staff. I mean, they're doing the work day in, day out, understand housing first, but it's to a different degree and different level when you're going through an opportunity like this, a bit of a chance for folks to participate in research. Again, it exposes programs to adaptations and innovations and sort of expands your network. Like, I still connect with the CMHA manager I connected with 4 years ago for the one for the other program. It's just you build your networks, and it's a great opportunity for that. Doing it virtually, the way that we did it, we were able to be flexible. We needed to be flexible on scheduling. And so for each of them, I think it was about maybe the course of about 3 weeks to complete each one. So we just completed the SHIP one just a few weeks ago, and the Irish one we did back before the summer. But we were able to sort of plan it out, because you have to sort of take into account the schedules of your team, their team, as well as building in the opportunity for clients to participate. So it gives you more time. And again, it was a low cost, just, factor in the honorariums, and that was really, other than staff time, that was really the only cost. So limitations, again, as I mentioned, it was a little challenging with the time difference to schedule client interviews. We had a couple people drop off. There was the challenge for observing a case review meeting. So we set it up, unfortunately, at the last minute. One of the case review meetings wasn't able to go through due to scheduling. Again, it is a bit of a demand for time, because there is the coordination of interviews and the assessment time that the frontline staff are really taking the lead with that. And yes, it's also recommended for more mature programs that are a little further in their housing first approach. So, did you want to speak to findings, or want me to keep going?
Yeah, let me just, we can just show the findings maybe. But I was going to say, I'm just sort of curious, how many of you would consider that idea of doing a peer fidelity assessment? Is there a program? It's one of the things we're going to figure out from this. The whole idea of doing the pilot, and God bless Catherine and her staff for signing up for this, because of course we want to get it out there. And through Wally's training unit and through the Canadian Housing First Network, we want to make it available. So it is something we're going to try to figure out a way of doing it. That's going to be part of what's going to happen next. But just to show what came through very, very quickly, because we want to get to this interactive exercise too. So you get together virtually. It's all virtual, obviously. So we get together with the Galway program staff. They've done interviews. I did the chart reviews. They've reviewed program documents. We come up with a score on each of the items. That's what happens. Galway does that on SHIP, and SHIP did it on Galway, okay? But we also want to get a sense of what's really good about this program. So what are the strengths, and what would we recommend to help improve this program? That was kind of what we wanted to get out of this. So you can see the strengths. I mean, there's a lot of strengths to this program. You can read them yourselves. But both of these programs were very strong programs. Not that they didn't have areas to improve on, which I'll get to, but they were clearly housing first programs with intensive support. They did assertive engagement. We certainly saw that, and so on, and they followed the principles and values and so on. So that's part of it, but then you can see the recommendations. These come out of the Fidelity items, the recommendations, okay? We heard community integration, and by the way, that's a challenge for most Housing First programs. people say, man, this housing is great. My life has changed through this housing. Now I'd like to do more with my time. I'd like to get out into the community. So the Galway said, well, you've got these interesting extra services that you rely on. Why don't you have a community integration officer who's dedicated to community participation? And you can see here boosting housing support, this idea of separating the housing and the services, service planning, which can be a real challenge, going beyond being reactive. This was a program that was very holistic. That was certainly the case. And then increasing peer support in the program. And the idea of having more primary care, and then just considering more frequent case conference meetings, which is important in that last area of program operations. So this just gives you a window on this last method that I think is practical, it's feasible, and it's economical. It doesn't mean you're not going to want to do, and some of you will do the external review that Wally talked about, but this is another one that I think has a lot of promise. Okay, so let's move to the interactive exercising. Okay, Wally's going to lead us on this.
So just really quickly before we do that, another comment about the sort of community integration. In our travels across Canada and other places, we have found that the two biggest reasons that people fall out of their housing situation, once they've been, supported by a Housing First program or whoever it is, the two biggest reasons that seem to crop up all the time are boredom and isolation. And so, it goes along with what Tim was saying in how valuable it is to ensure that people have, that's why Housing First is not housing only. And that to be honest with you, that's a sense of Housing First that I believe has gotten, for lack of a better word, bastardized over time. And that people forget that and how important it is. I've often used a metaphor of baseball where I say Housing First is just a single. Getting into housing is just a single. Now all the work begins to get around the rest of the bases. And what home base is, that's for that individual to decide, right? But all of that work has to happen, and so the case managers or whoever it is has piles and piles of work to do to support that person to have those things occur. And community integration and social integration, all of that stuff is part of it. And it has to be very intense work in order to make that possible. So what we want to do is have you look at the measure you were provided. And if there's an area, a particular topic, or a particular item that is of interest to you from your program, or just you want to learn a little bit more about it or have some discussion about it, I want you to have a look. And so each of those items are listed here. And if somebody has one in mind that you'd really like to explore a little bit further, then yeah, raise your hand and we're going to go through a little exercise with it. So yeah, go ahead. What number?
It's 3.
3. Okay. 3.
And I just also have a question because
Yeah.
does that percentage depend on how much the vacancies are in a particular location? Because I know that for in Winnipeg, probably 58% of people are housed within the first 8 weeks. But I know it's obviously really challenging to find them. So do those percentages vary depending on where?
Well, yes and no. Because, the reality is that when we come in, we try to be like super flexible and understanding of your situation. But in the end, I'll go back to what I said before in that you can't see this as a pass or fail. It's just that if you're able to get to the point where your program selects participants who fulfill criteria of multiple disabling conditions, including homelessness, severe mental illness, and substance use, then if that's where your program fits, then you get a 4. But if you're not, it's just, is it possible for us to shift things? Is it possible for us to maybe make some tweaks that can slightly improve that, right, and make that a little bit different? Right? Does that make sense? So we don't want you to be thinking it's just an all or nothing or black or white situation. That's why it's a continuum. Did you have a comment, Tim, you were going to say something? Okay. Okay. So what we want you to do, since this is the criteria here around it, this is what we would use to kind of gauge how well your program is doing in this area. You're going to get a chance now. All of you are going to get a chance using the app that we use to put in where you're from. Okay, I'm going to pull up another screen, and you're going to get to indicate where you believe that your program fits, whether you're a 1, 2, 3, or 4. And we ask you, based on the criteria, based on what you see written here, be super honest about it. Be super honest about where you fall, yeah?
I think just the 1 and the 2 and the 3 and the 4, I think they're mixed up between number 2 and 3. Oh, okay. Like the score for 3 and 4 is the score for priority enrollment, and then the 1 and 2 are for housing availability.
Oh, interesting.
If that makes sense.
Okay. Use your sheet. Use your sheet to gauge. It'll still be the same thing, right? So just answer the question based on the criteria you see on your sheet. Maybe that was a typo for number 3. Yeah. Okay. So the extent to which the program helps participants move quickly into permanent housing units of their choosing. So far, I mean, there's only 2 people that have plugged it in so far, but if you've all got the app, then just, if you're working in a program that does this type of work, or if you're the manager of a program or the executive director of a program, and maybe you don't have a ton of involvement in the day-to-day stuff, still just indicate what you think is happening. So far, the majority of people would be showing that they score a 1 on that scale. And so then that means what we would do, and if we scored it that way, in whichever method that is being used, we would be making notes about what we think is related to that topic. And then we'd be formulating recommendations, things that might help you in terms of advancing your program, or that might improve some aspect of your program or your processes to help improve that. Okay. And is there any questions about sort of the interpretation of the actual measure? Yeah.
It says permanent housing, and so does that then exclude the transitional housing? Because we don't break it down that detailed when someone sort of finds housing the day they start, the day that they're playing.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And again, this is stuff that sometimes we've had situations where an organization might score like a 1 or 2 based on the criteria, but then in the nuances of the report, because we write a very extensive report that outlines everything, all of our findings and the whys and hows. And so we would then describe in there that this is maybe a situation that is right now out of this organization's control. However, it's still important to be able to find ways to actually have your people move into permanent living situations, right? Because that's the whole thing. That's what this is based on, is the idea that if someone is in a permanent place as opposed to a transitional place, their likelihood of being more stable in housing is going to increase. Simply in part because if I'm in a permanent housing, if all I have to determine whether I get to stay here or not is whether I can adhere to the lease, this is my home. But if it's a transitional situation where there's possibly an expectation that I'm going to have to move out after a certain period of time, it's difficult just even mentally to wrap your head around that I have a vested interest in this. And so it doesn't mean that transitional housing is bad, and that's one of the things that I think has been a sad thing that has come out of the over time interpretation of housing first, The problem with transitional housing is not that it's transitional. The problem is that if it's mandated. If you're told you can't, we're not going to help you get access to permanent housing until you've proven yourself first in transitional housing. That's the challenge. And that's where we've eliminated choice. But if a choice is permanent housing in this building or transitional housing over here, some people may choose transitional housing because maybe they feel like I need some help to build up my life skills. And that transitional housing program might help me with that. So it's, the choice piece is important, and that would be highlighted in the report. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question. So we're talking about intake, like we use the by name list.
Yeah.
So are we talking about intake to a by name list, or are we talking intake to a case manager?
We're talking about, this is to housing, actually into housing. So if the intake to the by name list, I mean, that's the list. If it's to a case manager, if that automatically means you have a case manager now because you're in housing, well, then I guess that works. But there's, most of the time, a person is matched to a case manager, and then there's work being done to get them into housing, right?
So that's the intake.
Yeah.
Get them to case manager. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that-
I don't really work in housing anymore, but when I did, I don't think it operated like that.
Yeah. So some communities aren't referring somebody to a case manager until they are matched with housing as well.
I think that's kind of how we operate.
And that's fine. And that's stuff that we would look at. Like, we would take all that into account. But this measure is about how quickly are they going from being brought into your system or your program into housing. Right? Yeah. Somebody have another one? Yes. 41. Let's hope that this one is correct. Okay. So program representation, is that right? So what this means is participant voice in the program. Do the clients in the Housing First program have say in the operation of the program? Do they have a voice in policies? Do they have a voice in how it's being run, how the case management works? If there are changes in how the program works, do the participants get a chance to actually speak their mind about it? And this can happen oftentimes. Programs will have like participant advisory groups, or sometimes it's built into, when you're having your home visits or your different things like that, where you're getting input, but you're making sure that those participants are not just passive participants in Housing First, that they are actively involved in having a say in what's happening. And so you're taking as many measures as you can to get feedback from your participants about the program. Suggestion boxes, participant advisory groups, whatever it is, right? The more methods that you have, the better. Does that answer your question as to what it is about? Oh, okay, yeah. So for your programs, how do you score? How do you score based on that? And what are some of the methods that you used? And you can just shout them out. What are some of the methods that you guys use in your organization? Peer supports, okay? And so that's part of their job, is to get feedback from the people that you're working with to understand the program and get their point of view.
Like, sometimes we would have, well, in the past, we haven't had in a while, but we would have someone who was, had a successful tenancy for, 6 months to a year, who, really did a 180 in their life.
Mm-hmm.
From
Oh, I see what you're saying. So you've got, so what you're saying is this is a person who has gone through
another
the,
program.
yeah.
Like in the same program,
Yeah.
they're,
Yeah.
saying like, this is what the program did to help me, this is what,
Mhm.
where, depending on where you're wanting to go, like what do you want to do, what do you want to see,
Mm-hmm.
like change happen in your life.
Yeah.
And they kind of like help guide them along.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Okay.
It's there for any kind of support to talking and.
Yeah. What other methods do you guys have where you get feedback from your clients about how the program is operating. Yeah.
Our agency does an annual results-based accountability survey with all the programs.
Mhm.
So we get
Mhm.
survey responses from participants that ask like what we're doing well, what we can do better, what services
Yeah. Yeah.
we can offer.
Yeah.
And then from that, we collect the data and implement any
Yeah.
agency-wide program-specific changes.
Yeah, that's great. And some people will incorporate like exit interviews with your clients if they've left the program or whatever. And the whole point is that the more opportunities you can offer, the higher in fidelity you're going to be. Because, again, not your example is a great one that you should have in place. But if that was the only thing you did, then you're only getting feedback once a year, and who knows how many clients have maybe left your program during that time, and you might not get that feedback from them, right? So, yeah. Okay, do we have another one? Somebody have another one that they want to, yeah. 36.
I'm asking this because I'm kind of pushed right now. We have 18 December 1st. I'm working with IT, so many barriers. I see staff burn out so quick.
Yeah.
Participants just want to do their practice.
When we do fidelity reviews, we hear constantly, we're firefighting. We're in crisis management mode all the time, the case managers. We don't see our participants moving forward because we don't have enough time, because we're running around putting out fires all day long. And when that happens, there's two things that we find are usually the culprits. That's one of them. Too high of staff to participant caseload ratio. The second one, home visits are not happening. At least appropriate home visits are not happening. Okay? So, again, there is, as Tim mentioned earlier, there's a difference between sort of the ACT expectations and the intensive case management expectations. However, what I would say is that we have been moving, and part of this is because some places don't have the capacity to have those clinical supports directly on a Housing First team. And so people are having to deal with the highest complexity individuals in your community through an intensive case management system. And so intensive case managers are often dealing with things the same way that an ACT, the same types of complexities an ACT team would be. But we are recommending often, even though it's listed here as best practice a different way, we're recommending that even intensive case management programs should be at like a 10-to-1 or less. Youth stuff is different. Youth stuff is even down to 7-to-1. Okay, so where do your programs fall?
We broker out our case management.
Yep.
So they come in from all these different community agencies. So how would we measure that? Like, because I don't know what their caseloads are. Like we have, because they're not strictly with us, they've got other, right, they've got other mandates within the community and they work with other.
So then what would happen is that we would have conversations with those people, and we would gain an understanding of like, okay, so you're working with whatever, 5 people from this organization, you're working with 5 clients from that organization, whatever. So I'd get an understanding of, okay, it sounds like that you guys are working off of like 20 people to 1. And regardless of if they're only working with 5 of yours, we'd be telling them this is probably not going to be super effective for you, right? So again, that would all come out in the report, the description about it. So it looks like most people are getting there, but you know, there's a hump to get over, and it's hard, it's challenging, because usually it means more money to have additional case managers to effectively provide supports to those to the numbers that you have, right? Yeah.
Is there acuity kind of for the caseloads on what that 10 looks like as far as?
Sorry, is there a what?
Like the acuity?
Oh, acuity. So there are methods. I mean, that's something that actually I could provide you with is a method that we have recommended to people to use to kind of determine how many how many you should have and so forth based on acuity. So let's say you're operating off a 12-to-1, well, depending upon your acuity, a person at a certain acuity might actually equal 2 people, right? Yeah, so I can certainly provide you with something like that. Yep. Okay, any other questions about that one? Yeah.
I have a question in general.
Sure.
In terms of the Fidelity scales of applicability to fixed site supported housing, recognizing that that is everywhere and quality improvement is important to those types too.
Yeah.
Is there an adaptation of this scale?
So, another great question. I was just down in Texas, actually, this summer doing a Fidelity review down there. And they are a fixed site place. So the short answer to your question is yes. This is completely applicable because all of the nuances that we take into account when we go and the way I look at it, because one of the measures talks about scattered site, right? And so somebody, if they're fixed site, would technically score a 1 on that measure. But the biggest thing for me is okay, well, how is choice being incorporated into that site? And one of the questions that we asked this group in Texas, because it's a 24-unit retrofitted apartment complex that is actually owned by the program, and it's all their Housing First participants that live in those units. But and they have 2 levels. There's a second floor and a first floor. And our question is do people, if you have more than 1 unit to come into, do they actually get to choose, or are they being assigned which unit they go to? And they said, well, some people, because they have mobility issues and we don't have an elevator, there's no way they could go to the second floor. And so, yeah, we just, if one is on the first floor, we just tell them, okay, this is what you would get. Our recommendation was actually to consider not just assigning, even though it might seem obvious, but let them know that both options are available. And for whatever reason, maybe they decide, I'd actually like to be on that second level, and I'd like to try to make it work. Or if they can't, they can't. Maybe they're in a wheelchair and they know they can't. At least they're the ones that get to tell you, right? So that's all stuff that we would take into account. And so again, it's like, okay, well, we only get a 1 on this particular item, but you might score super high ultimately at the end of that whole review for the whole report. It's just that one item is like, you know what, that's an area that we really can't change. So what are some ways we can tweak things?
You just remove an item like that?
I wouldn't remove it. I think it's important to just keep in mind that the more ability we have for people to be in independent apartments that are permanent. And so in some ways too, we look at things like that and say, well, is this a permanent place? Can they stay there forever if they want? Well, then to me, that's not a lot different than market housing, right? If you get to choose and stay there. Yeah.
Why do you have the word private market housing? Can a nonprofit be considered private market housing? It sounds very much like a for-profit word.
Yeah, I think it was more meant to, and that's an adjustment that, like Tim said, we might make some more adaptations. But just in wording, that's something, because it's really more about, if you have a landlord out there that's just a normal, regular landlord in the private marketplace, and they're renting a place to you. So it's not necessarily landing on that idea that because there's also the master lease concept, right? Where an organization will go out and will lease multiple units from private landlords, but now they've become sort of the sub-landlord. It's still private. It's still,
But it can be social housing.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yep.
Scattered. It's at 20%. I wonder, Wally, we should get to any final questions.
Yeah, what time we got?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. Okay, so I would just suggest that, take the scale and go through it. And if nothing else, you're getting a sense of, how it might benefit you. And then the last thing I'll say before we can see if there's other questions or whatever is, shoot, I lost it. It went. Yeah.
I will say, I just want to, before you leave,
Oh, I know.
if your organization didn't participate in the survey that the Canadian Housing First Network has completed recently, if you want information from the network about webinars, about this work on housing fidelity, about research, if you could come just put your name and email, and we'll add you to the Canadian Housing First Network mailing list. So if anybody's interested in that, on the way out, if you could just jot down your name, and there's 2 sheets of paper.
The network has also created an inventory of Housing First programs across the country. So if you're not sure if your Housing First program was included in that inventory, it would be really important to put your contact information down so that other Housing First programs across the country may be able to reach out to you on best practices and how your programs are running or what supports you're offering. So that would be important as well. Are there any last burning questions? Lots of questions. Go ahead.
SHIP organization.
Mm-hmm.
I forget your name.
Catherine?
You said it took a lot of time to do this pilot project, and I really wanted an idea of how much time and how that worked out for your team. Like, you said it took 3 weeks for this and then 3 weeks for that, and so I was just curious because that's expensive. And
So I wouldn't say it's a lot of time. I think it's probably took me a couple hours to redact and prepare the files for review. Some of the time that goes into it is identifying, which staff are going to be a part of it, which clients to reach out to see if they're interested in it, and then the scheduling. But I would say, like, I've done this twice now, and I would do it again. I think that really the value of it really mitigates any time you put into it. I think if you have a lead within your organization that can do some of the coordination, that takes away from the time that it would take from the frontline staff. So I would suggest an administrative person that wants to do a project could take it on, and then it's really just allotting time for the interviews for the clinical staff, and my team were more than happy with the results.
That was actually what I was going to talk about, was if you're wondering, well, which approach should we take? Which approach makes most sense? I would say, well, any of them are going to be good. Any of them are going to be helpful for you in some way. But if you really, if you've never done a fidelity review before, and if you're an organization who really wants to make sure that your program is kind of trying to check off all the boxes and do all the right things, then I would say if you can swing it, doing an external review would probably be the best option to start with. But otherwise, then you can go to like your peer-to-peer stuff and your self-assessments and those kinds of things to just keep the machine oiled, right? And yeah, we can talk later about the money.
We're going to try to figure out with Wally, even for the Fidelity Exchange, you really need a facilitator separate from the 2 programs, the logistics and so on. So there would be a small cost for that, to pay for that facilitator's time. But it would be less than the external review.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier in the presentation that an external review would be probably somewhere around the neighborhood of, like, if you include the travel expenses and everything else, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of around 10,000. Yeah.
Great.
Other questions? No. Okay. Anyone else? No? Go ahead.
The criteria, does it take into account situations like what we had pandemic right now? Does it take into account the landscape? 5 years ago we had the land crisis, now it's fentanyl. So the level of service delivery is not the same, but I mean, the criteria still impacted indirectly by everything capacity. So do you get to that?
Actually, no. And the reason for it, again, is back to that idea that this is not a punitive process, right? It's really just meant to say, like, for example, if you were a runner and you knew that if I can train with this regimen, this training regimen for this period of time and do these particular exercises or whatever, that I am going to give myself the most optimal opportunity to be able to run the best that I can, right? Whatever conditions come about, it may impact your ability to engage in some of those activities, but it doesn't change that those activities would still give you the most optimal body to run with. So that's what we're saying, is that you know, there are things, and that's why the report is so helpful, because it may say, well, based on the scores, this is where you're at, but here's the ins and outs and the whys of that, and here's what we understand is different, and here's where these circumstances come into play. And so what that will do is that will shift recommendations. So a recommendation in one situation might be very clear cut based on the criteria. But in another situation, the recommendation might be different because of those changing circumstances.
How do you speak that language to say, hey, this is happening? How do you develop
Yeah, I think what we would just say is that this is an area that right now is out of their control. But however, if A, B, and C changes or shifts, or these are some things that it would be important to advocate for, like that's often recommendations that we make, and when we do our reports, we'll make both program and systemic recommendations. So we'll often talk to members of the system of care, and we'll say, there's some things that you guys could do as a system to make it better for this program, because the program can't necessarily change that. But as a system, you could make some adjustments in how you operate that allows for the program to actually be more in fidelity, which is going to mean the results for their participants are going to be better. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay.
Okay. So thank you for everybody that stayed over for a few extra minutes. I just want to again thank our speakers today on the presentation. And if you want to follow up, please do so.